I started off working in record stores when I was still at high school, and in uni I played in indie bands and then worked as a freelance music journalist. In the early 90s I started off doing A&R at Sony Music, and then left there to manage Silverchair, who myself and John O'Donnell had signed. And in 1995 started up my own management company then, and have been doing it ever since. The artists with whom we work at the moment include Midnight Oil, Cold Chisel, Birds of Tokyo, The Presets, Missy Higgins, Gotye, and we do consult for Jimmy Barnes as well. Over my 25 years now of being a manager, lots of the means by which artists earn a living have changed substantially, gone from selling bits of plastic to making money out of streams. The means have changed, but fundamentally the job is still about helping artists do the things they either don't want to do for themselves or can't do for themselves. I think life in the music industry, like life in most industries, was quite a blur. So because of social media, for example, you have to be doing that for yourself. You can't just rely on the record company getting the video on MTV and the song on the radio while you go to the beach. You actually have to be engaged every day, creating content, creating points of engagement for audiences. So there was already a lot more to do. Also, because of the plethora of entertainment options that have been available for audiences, you can't go away for a year or two at a time and then come back with your new album like you used to do. Artists used to go through cycles. You would release an album, you'd be very busy around that time, you'd go off on tour, you'd release singles off the album for a year or so, then the touring would come to an end, the artist would go off and make a record, and there'd be this sort of, the field would lie fallow for a season. You have to be always on. There are periods where you're more on than others, but you still, are constantly engaging and constantly, keeping that relationship alive. So that meant that we were much busier. We were constantly on, and we were having to do more of it for ourselves. In talking to other managers, there was certainly a feeling of burnout, I think, from many people at the increasing workloads. Business was great. The touring scene was, very profitable. And, at least at our end of the business, while some artists are always struggling and managers are struggling, my view was that streaming had made the world more interconnected. So there was a new generation of Australian artists who were making leaps and bounds internationally in a way that past generations probably hadn't, because streaming had removed all borders. The world was flat. But again, there was a greater workload. Now, post-COVID-19, people are still busy, but they're nowhere as busy. They're also making nowhere near as much money. So, there's a lot of economic challenges. We're in a better position than most. But yeah, it's certainly been a seismic change. Instead of perhaps, working on an album quietly in the dark for a year and then dropping the whole thing, you might be dropping a song every 3 months, releasing the music as it comes to you, and then putting it together as an album sort of at the end of that process. There's that old John Lennon line, "Life's what happens to you while you're busy making other plans." And it certainly does feel like that at the moment, that there was all of this planning, which seems almost laughable under the circumstances when you consider what we were thinking we were going to be doing now. A lot of artists, counterintuitively, are quite introverted, quite solitary. They write songs as their means of self-expression precisely because they're not great at, talking to people. Of course, they then ironically find themselves standing in front of 10,000 people screaming their name. But inherently, they're relatively solitary people that quite enjoy sort of being in a bedroom with a guitar. So for those people, this time has perhaps been less challenging, particularly if they're surrounded by family and, they have that sort of support structure, that social support structure. I think it's probably harder for those who are more isolated and, find themselves sort of locked alone or with only one other person. There are some artists, including some with whom we work, that actually really love the interaction with audience. Not just in the sense of getting out on stage and doing their thing, but, they don't mind being stopped for selfies. They quite like, getting the good table in the restaurant and having heads turn as they walk in or whatever. There's the odd one or two of those. Not most of artists aren't like that, but there's one or two that are. Those people are definitely struggling. There's also a lot of people, and I'm not talking about our company or our roster now, but perhaps people with whom we deal, who are used to being super busy all the time and who actually don't really know how not to be super busy all the time. And it's very interesting watching those people kind of create busyness because they just can't stand the sound of their own head or something. So, ironically for me personally, we had an extremely busy 2019, particularly with Jimmy's last tour and album, and then rolling straight out of that into a big Cold Chisel tour. We've had Midnight Oil in the studio. Missy was touring over summer. There's a big Presets record last year. Birds of Tokyo had a string of singles leading into their album early this year. They too were touring over summer. So there was lots going on. If, as is quite possible, touring at a top level does not resume at all over the Australian summer, then things will start to get a lot more serious for our business, and we'll have to be making some much more difficult changes. I mean, it felt like it happened. Well, was it F. Scott Fitzgerald's wonderful line about the Great Depression, the bankruptcy happened very, very slowly, then suddenly in a hurry or all at once. Coronavirus was similar. It happened very slowly and then in a hurry. It went from being a hypothetical concern to an existential threat in the space of probably 10 days. And I think once all gigs were cancelled, from that late March period, once lockdown was instituted, it quickly became apparent then that this was not just a blip. This was like nothing we'd seen in our lifetimes. And then when Splendour in the Grass got moved quite quickly, got moved out of late July into October, that was when you realised, and all of our Midnight Oil plans had been built around that Splendour. We're going to release around that period. The band was going to be doing shows around that period. So all of our oils plans were just sort of being picked up and moved into the TBC basket after 12 months of planning. My wife's a doctor in the emergency department at St Vincent's, so there was also probably a fair amount of exposure to the medical realities through that period, which meant that personally I was probably a little more attuned to what the stakes were than might otherwise have been the case. The very real and massive impact that this has had on many people. We're lucky to be in the situation we're in because of the timing of our touring. There was another manager who I spoke to, when all this first started to go down, who was in tears because their artists touring had all been, they had an album that was just about to drop. Their touring was kicking off in March and they were touring in Europe right through the northern summer. They'd spent all the costs on that. All the money had gone out the door. None of it had come back in yet. And now everything was cancelled. And they were literally in sort of, go out and remortgage their house territory. So there's some terrible situations. On the work front, I think there was a lot of concern from our staff, about their job security. And we had to assure them that, there were no impending plans to sort of shut the doors. That became much easier for everybody, I think, once the JobKeeper allowance was announced, and notwithstanding some of the teething issues around that program, I think it's stood Australia in really good stead when you look at the global situation. I think people have been able to rest a little bit easier, knowing that, okay, that's at least I've got my rent covered and I know I can buy groceries. That period between the sky falling down and the announcement of JobKeeper, I think, was the darkest period for people. But once JobKeeper became a reality, I felt like everybody sort of was able to breathe a little bit more. And then in terms of the artists, in terms of our clients, very different reactions from different people depending upon, their own particular personal circumstances. So Missy Higgins, for example, who's got 2 young kids, has been juggling the unenviable task of trying to keep them entertained and engaged, locked up in a house. And how many cubby houses can you build out of cardboard boxes in the garage, which she's literally been doing, and is quite proud of her garage cubby boxes. For Midnight Oil, it was frustrating because, they haven't released new music in nearly 20 years. They have 2 albums in the can, and they're both just sitting on pause while we wait to figure out, okay, how can we actually go about releasing these? You know, at least they're not, it would be worse in a way if they were sort of half out. If the bullet had left the gun, as it were, you would have much more trouble refining your plans. As it stands, they can, you know, pause for a moment. The challenge for them, of course, is that a lot of the songs in classic Oils fashion are issues-based. So reconciliation, climate change, things like that. And trying to get those messages heard when everyone's focused on, you know, when will there be a vaccine, is much harder as well. So that brings its own sort of complexity. In the very short term, we had enough, like we had to get the Birds of Tokyo record out and we had to reschedule all the dates. The Cold Chisel Tour was its own stressful thing because of the bushfires. So there was, you know, costs going everywhere and production stuff going everywhere because roads were closed and things were being flown and last minute changes to this, that and the other. So there was a lot of untangling that was going on with the settlement of that tour. So that kept us busy, and it was nice to be able to focus on that, you know, with less of the daily sort of incoming, if that makes sense. So those two tasks, I think, gave us something to keep us busy through a good chunk of April. And it's only really now that we're sort of, and rerouting, as I say, the Birds Tokyo tour, for example, the presets were in the middle of a tour. So there was quite a difficult process of resolving what the settlement of that looked like with promoters and their own situation with their crew and various costs. Having done all of those things, we're now closer to being able to use our time for forward-looking things. So immediately following this, I've got a conference call with a client that's all about 2021 planning. You know, the truth is there's only so much of that you can, there's only so far you can go down that road because there's still so much uncertainty about what you'll be able to do. So you can make plans, but everything's written in pencil at the moment. I think there's a lot of people, you know, penciling plans, but trying not to waste too much time on them because we're all realizing that, you know, there's a good chance that they won't actually transpire in the way that we think. There's also been a lot of time. I'm on the board of Support Act, so I've spent quite a bit of time on that. I think there's, you know, now a sort of an awareness of Support Act throughout the industry that didn't exist before, and outside the industry, and the fact that, you know, the government's given $10 million to the organisation. Well, that's a pretty big step. So I think that's been really great. Whether it's, you know, the ISOL shows that have happened online, whether it's the things that Mark Budinsky's been doing, you know, with the assistance of the Victorian State Government, each of these things seem to land in a mad flurry of, oh my God, it's got to be done in 4 days. So those two have probably kept our eyes off the horizon a bit. But generally speaking, I think the main thing I've done, if I'm being completely honest, is that I've had more time for myself. In the first 4 days of lockdown, I put on 2 kilos. So I made a vow at that point that if I didn't want to be one of those people that, you know, they had to airlift out, like on a, you know, take the roof off the house and take them out on a stretcher because they wouldn't fit out the door. I'm now down 10 kilos, counting the 2 that I'd put on. So I'm trying to sort of keep the positivity around that. After about 2 or 3 weeks, it felt like people started to really actually look for that human connection and sort of want to just have a chat. What do you think is going to happen? I don't know. What do you think is going to happen? So there's been a lot of that that's gone on, and I don't know if that's inspiring, but it's been affirming and interesting. And, you know, one of the $1 million questions around all of this is what will be the things that we carry forward out of this experience. Some friends of mine on a call the other day described as living in the 70s, which I thought was pretty true. It does feel a lot like, I don't know whether that's just because childhood is inherently, you end up being bored more of the time as a kid. That was when we were all kids, or whether the pace of life at that point in time was slower. But there's a pace of life difference right now that I know many people would like to hold on to at least some of that. I hope that the exercise part that I'm doing, I will be able to continue doing. Professionally, I'd like to also think that some of the more rambling conversations, that I'll have opportunities for those. As distinct from every conversation being rushed, transactional, almost resentful, you know, because you're just like, oh God, can't we do this over an email? Can't we do this more quickly? You know, and it's been quite nice to sort of, you know, talk about how other people's kids are getting through it and all that kind of stuff. So hopefully there'll be some hanging on to that. You know, the amount of stuff that our artists have done to support their crew and their bands, just quietly, you know, taking the money from this thing and just quietly giving it to the band and crew. The other sort of feeling that I've had around what's going on at the moment is it reminds me a little bit, there's that period every year between Christmas and New Year where everything sort of stops. And it always feels like the curtains are pulled back. You get this little glimpse at real life, you know, like what you would actually be doing if you didn't have to do all that other stuff. And then the curtains get closed again when everybody goes back to work and you sort of, was that just an illusion or, you know? And so this has felt to me like sort of almost an extended, much more traumatic because of the health risk, much more traumatic because of the unemployment and the uncertainty. But, you know, it's family, it's simple entertainment pleasures, it's cooking at home, it's a game of cards, it's all of that sort of stuff. It's not fancy stuff. It's simple stuff. And a lot of it can be quite fulfilling at risk of sounding, you know, a bit dull. So again, I think that there's those realizations as well that hopefully we can hang on to a bit of. I've been reading some books about the Great Depression, just for the fun of it. But you know, all the lessons you take out of looking at past crises is that there is definitely a filtering process that happens. You know, people who were already in very marginal businesses or who were already feeling ambivalent about being in the business are the first to get shaken out. One of the scary things is that it tends to favour the big players. So historically, you'll find that it's smaller players that get, you know, they don't have the capital base to get through the tough times. That's really unfortunate. So there'll probably be a concentration. Certainly in America, you're seeing there'll be a complete rewriting of how the touring industry works. You know, the whole basis on which big advances get given on shows, and you know, artists then just sort of tour around on those and gradually pay them back. And I just think that model will go out the door, and there'll be a little bit more sharing of the risk, sharing of the reward. There'll also be a bit of a land grab because everybody's going to have suffered loss during this period and be seeking to make up all those losses on the other side. But the cake's not going to be any bigger. If anything, the cake will be smaller because we'll be in the middle of a recession. So, you know, there's going to have to be an adjustment of expectations that, you know, it's actually not going to be possible just because you lost $500,000 over those 6 months. You're not necessarily going to make that $500,000 on top of what you'd have already made next summer. In fact, you're probably not going to make next summer what you thought you would have going to make next summer, let alone that $500,000. So there'll definitely be a fair bit of friction as everyone's sort of selfish expectations come into, you know, conflict with each other. The stuff that will endure, I think, the artists who've used this time to engage more deeply and more fully with their audiences will come out of it with stronger fan bases, you know, more loyalty from those fans. You know, they'll be the artists that help their fans get through that period, you know, and there'll always be a fondness to them for that. And so I think that you'll find there'll be some, don't want to overstate it, but there'll be some residual lingering attachments formed between audiences and certain artists who've been very active over this period in time. And I suspect there'll also be, you know, a glut of new music in the first half of next year. I suspect that most artists who would have been touring now, I'm talking globally here, bearing in mind that, you know, this mid-year period is typically the rush hour for touring internationally. So you've got all of the big acts from all around the world who would normally have been out playing festivals over the northern summer who are at home. What else are they going to do? They're going to make some records, right? So fourth quarter this year, first 2 quarters of next year, I think you'll see just this huge avalanche of music that was all created during this time. I also suspect that there'll probably be about, you know, 1 million songs written about being cooped up on your own. And, you know, after the first 5 or 10 of them, you know, make an impact, the other 999,990 are going to be a bit tedious. So, and as always with these things, there'll be the unknown unknowns. There'll be things that we don't, that will seem blindingly obvious to us when we get to them, which aren't obvious to us now. All we can do is continue to recognize that if you back creativity, with the artist, and you help them make great works of self-expression, and you help those artists connect to an audience, you'll always have a purpose and you'll always have a business. Now, it might not make you as much money as it made you in an age where you could put 20,000 people in a winery every Saturday night for the whole of summer, but there will still be a place for it because it's an important part of how human beings connect. There were lots of stories in the newspaper about how the music business was shrinking. Well, the music business wasn't shrinking, the recording industry was shrinking. But the music business as a whole was continuing to largely grow because touring continued to be, a growth industry. We now have a complete 180-degree turn of that, where record companies, because they're now primarily collecting their revenues from streaming, still a bit of physical business, which has been a little bit affected by this. But generally speaking, record companies have been largely unaffected by this current situation. So it's very interesting that everybody who comfortably wore the other shoes for those 17 or 18 years is now going, well, hang on, the answer is we need a piece of the record company's business. Not saying there's not some justification to it on other grounds, on moral grounds, looking at, particularly the issue of whether a stream is actually a sale or a net receipt. That's, something that will play out at the pace that it plays out. But I think it's a little bit ironic that all of a sudden, after 18 years of sort of having the good part, all of a sudden you've got the bad part. And the music business has always been an insane crapshoot. It's it's an irrational business. It's highly volatile. We make a product that only partially exists to be consumed. It's at least partially a product of self-expression of artists. In all sorts of ways, it's a crazy business, so it tends to attract people who are a little bit on the crazy side anyway. And hopefully that will allow them to ride out the craziness. I hope that the music industry can return reasonably quickly to some live models that work for everybody. Everybody's going to need to trim their sails a little bit, and providing that happens, everybody can rebuild together. If we see more monopoly powers emerging, which could happen, then that would be an extremely disappointing outcome, given that the industry, generally speaking, has worked really collegially through the crisis. So in other words, having got through it all by helping each other, it would be terrible if we come out the other side and one of the people that's been helping each other leaps on top and screws everybody else. And that could well happen because of the concentration of power. If you look at the way agencies are closing in America, just for example, or laying off staff. I'm speaking on a global basis here, perhaps more than an Australian basis, but there's definitely a monopoly threat on the other side of this. My hope is that that's resisted, and the current quite collegial helping hand spirit which has prevailed will continue to prevail. It probably won't. It sounds a bit kumbaya when you say it, but certainly for some people, I think they'll remember who helped them get through the rough times and be more inclined to act in a similar way themselves. I don't think there's a fast rebound from this either, just by the way. I really don't see this sort of V-shaped recovery that people talk about. Please God, I'm proved wrong. And if they found a vaccine, in a month or two, then yes, that could change everything. There is a sort of an in-between stage, which could be nice for the Australian industry in helping itself get itself back on its feet, which is sort of a summer in which overseas artists can't get into the country to tour, or to the extent that they can, they're not willing to serve out the quarantine. And so there's very little international touring, and Australian artists get a sort of a summer to kind of make up what they've missed over the winter. That would be nice for the management community, the local agent community, the local artist community. However, there's plenty of parts of the Australian music industry that would be still very badly hurt by that. Promoters would be badly hurt by that. Security companies, catering companies, merch companies, you know, the people that rent out the barriers, the people that rent the PAs and lights. You know, they are all making money out of international shows, which would be go-on venues. So, you know, one of the things about this situation is it reminds us, as we are constantly reminded, that the music industry is a loose alliance of not perfectly aligned interests. That, you know, while the record companies and the publishers and the managers and the artists and the promoters have like Venn diagrams with intersections, they all also have interests which are not necessarily aligned with each other. So, you know, it's great that record companies are making lots of money out of streaming. That's helping artists to some extent, but it's really probably not feeding too many people. And, you know, you can make your way right around the ecosystem and do the same. You know, plenty of times the record companies have sat there and gone, we did all the money, all the work making that record a hit, and the promoter made all the money out of selling the tickets. So, you know, at the moment, everybody, with the somewhat exception of record companies, is doing it tough. And I think that the bounce back will happen at different paces for different segments of the industry. You know, my solace in all of this, though, is I remember many years ago reading a book on the William Morris Agency. It was the history of the William Morris Agency, like a century-long sort of thing. And they're talking about the career of George Burns, the old American vaudeville star, and who became a radio star, and radio was the thing, and then became a movie star, and then became a TV star. And, you know, over sort of all these different periods where there was a dominant form of entertainment. And they're making the case that at no point in that period was he the most powerful or most affluent person in the entertainment industry. He was the only person who could point to having endured for 70 or 80 years across it. You know, the vaudeville entrepreneur came and went, the radio entrepreneur came and went. So talent will always be the thing that, it might not be the one that's making the most, but there will always be a place for talent. Everything else can come and go. No talent, you got nothing. So as a consequence, the people who help that talent add value to their careers, you know, managers, providing they're genuinely doing that, should always have a place at the table as well. Sometimes there'll be more to eat on that table than others, but there'll always be a place for it because people want to experience the magic that only artists can bring.